Welcome to the Big O Show on the Overreaction Sports Network, powered by Believe.
Still the same damn kid from Oklahoma, same old dreams hanging off my shoulders, wishing and waiting on a shooting star for all to see.
And now your host, straight out of Oklahoma, former Buffalo Bill, Jerry Ostroski.
I'm still the same damn kid from Oklahoma.
Welcome in, everybody. Same show, same time, new night. We're on Wednesday nights now. This is the Big O Show on the Overreaction Buffalo Sports Network. We are powered by Believe. I am excited tonight. We've got a special guest with us. He is from the Believe Network, Joe Deleone, and you can catch him on some shows like the Fina and Joe Show, which is a weekly college football show. Also, he's on the AtoZ Sports Film Room, that show as well. They do a bunch of film work. I checked out some of his stuff today, and I'm going to ask him some questions about that because you did have some interesting things that I want to get into. But, Joe, thanks for joining us. I know it's draft season, and you are crazy busy.
Yeah, trying to navigate all the craziness, but always excited to talk some ball. Very excited to be on with you today, and I'm sure that we'll get into some players that the Bills could take that help them reach that goal of winning a Super Bowl.
Definitely. Before we get into specific players, especially I want to kind of dig into a couple positions because I think it's pretty obvious the Bills need some help at corner and need some help inside at the defensive line spot. Just kind of your assessment of the Bills this offseason, you know, after the free agent period and all of that. How do you see that free agent period kind of shaping what Brandon Beane and this front office does, especially in the first round of the draft?
Yeah, I think that naturally when you have a contract for a quarterback like you do with Josh Allen, and you're committing that much money, you have to get creative, and you also have to hit home runs in the draft. So for the past couple of years, and then in the future for the next few years, they're going to have to continue to have success with their draft picks. I think that more than any other franchise, the Bills have been fantastic at evaluating and finding guys on day 2 and on day 3 to be contributing players. And I have been a fan of their philosophy and the philosophy that they had last year, which was trading back and getting Keon Coleman and accumulating more picks. And they now have the opportunity this upcoming draft to continue to find that depth. When you have somebody who is MVP caliber like Josh Allen, you can allow for him to carry the team, but if you don't have the contributing cast, then it is going to continue to be shortfallings every single year in that AFC Championship game.
You know, Joe, it's funny because that kind of morphs into the next thing I wanted to ask you. And I did watch one of your mock drafts with one of your partners, and you did have the Bills trading out of the first round and kind of stacking a couple of top picks in the second. But if you look at Buffalo picking 30th overall, they've got 2 second-round picks. They've got some extra picks stacked up. If one of those guys at that cornerback or defensive line position slip a little bit, can you see maybe them doing the opposite this season and moving up to try to get a guy like, say it is Will Johnson, the cornerback from Michigan? It maybe slips into that 15-13 area. You know, a lot of people in Buffalo, myself included, kind of think maybe this is the year they might move up to get one of those guys that slips down. How do you see that fitting in with the franchise, especially with the cap situation they're in?
Right. I think there's 2 philosophies ultimately for a contending team like this, specific to this draft class. This draft class does not have a lot of premier names at the top. It does not have a lot of guys that are going to go on to be blue chip all-pro players on a consistent basis. But instead, and this is, I think, where the class keeps getting mischaracterized, there's a lot of really good depth. There's a lot of guys after pick, like, let's say, 18, going all the way to the end of the second round that are probably going to have very similar grades on most team sports. Just a lot of second round grades, meaning quality to average starters for most teams. So for the Bills' sake, Will Johnson's the example of a guy that you go and trade up for. There is a world, and it's been one that's been pitched by a lot of mainstream draft analysts and just reporters in general, that he could slide. He had the turf toe injury this year. He wasn't a full participant for most of the season. The lack of film seems to be a driving force for him maybe falling. The same thing could be applied for Savon Ravel, who is the ECU corner, who I think is going to be amazing in the NFL. He's 6'3", he's tall, he's long, he's super fluid, but he's coming off of an ACL injury. Should be a first rounder, but if he starts to slide, he and Johnson, those are those two guys that if you're the Bills sitting where you are, trading up to pick 20 or 22, where it wouldn't require you to completely mortgage your future, it's smart for the Bills to do that so that they can take that next step and not just getting a good starter, but getting a premier player. Will Johnson, for me, is absolutely one of those guys that I think has the potential to go on to be an all-pro type guy. But if either of them aren't on the board, they're not in the mix, or they can't make that trade up happen, that was why I projected them moving back, is that they can use the additional capital that they pick up, those 2 second-round picks that you mentioned, to get just guys to fill out and round out the depth of your team with any of those selections on day 2.
I'd have to think with at least their first selection, even second selection. I mean, this is a franchise now that's going to have to rely on young guys to play early with some of the holes they have. And, you kind of brought that up with a lot of depth, not a lot of first round grades this year in the draft. With that being said, are the Bills in a position, knowing they have so many needs at defense, can they sit there and wait for and basically go with drafting the best available player on defense that fills one of those spots? It seems to me that maybe that would make a lot of sense as well, whether you do that at 30 or you do trade back and go into the top part of the second round again.
Right. I think that's the big advantage with this defensive heavy class. Again, knowing like what the Bills need to take that next step is having high floor players to contribute, having a lot of different high floor options to contribute. It's when they signed Joey Bosa, it kind of makes me think of like what this approach is of trying to go with guys that are going to play hard or going to play well, but maybe don't have super high level production. That's kind of why, like with bringing in Bosa, is he's not that same guy that once was a top 5 pick, but we just know that he's going to give full effort if he's healthy and he's out there. But I do think that having that ability, as you just talked about, to approach it of best player available, they are able to look at the board and see what's out there for them if there is no trade back option and nobody wants to come in to take maybe the third or fourth quarterback that's still on the board that they might love. And as we're talking about here, again, this class has a lot of really good defensive tackles. It has a lot of really good cornerbacks. It's got really good safety play as well. There's an opportunity here where they could be sitting and not having to move, and they could draft Nick Emenwari, the safety from South Carolina who had a freakish NFL Combine performance, or Malachi Starks, the safety from Georgia, who is fantastic in coverage just because of their positional value. So, yeah, I think that best player available approach is smart for a team like the Bills that have superstars and premier guys at other positions.
Joe Deleone joins us from the Believe Network, former Division I football athlete. Big fan of Reed Ferguson?
I got to talk to him once. I am a fan of Reed Ferguson and his brother Blake. They're very good long snappers. No, but yeah, I do. I appreciate them. Of course, I love any NFL long snapper.
I do have to add, Joe was a long snapper, and what's funny is that he had the job that, people say whatever they want, but nobody wanted to do it. So
that's what I
never wanted to do it.
That's what I always love to say. My roommate now, and he was my roommate in college. He was a backup offensive lineman at Rhode Island, and he always likes to joke with me. He could have taken my job. Everybody always loved to say that when I was playing, that they could have taken the starting snapper job, but it's not as easy as it looks.
All right, exactly. I remember my offensive line coach at Tulsa when I played. He's like, "Hey, we need to work on long snapping before the draft." I'm like, no. Don't want any parts of it. Don't want to do it. But hey, I do want to bring something else up, Joe. You guys had a mock draft on, and you guys were going back and forth. And I believe it was on your Ruffino and Joe show. If I'm not correct with that, you can correct me. But you made a pick that was interesting, and I thought it was very interesting in the fact that in the first round, where we're looking at a team that needs cornerback, needs inside defensive lineman, needs safeties, there's a bunch of stuff on the defense. You had the Bills taking Matthew Golden, the wide receiver from Texas, who at the time was, and I think you might have said it, if he's not the highest rated wide receiver, he's one of the highest rated wide receivers, and had him slipping down to 30. Is that a scenario that you could see?
I think this wide receiver class is super volatile. I have Matthew Golden as my number one receiver in this class. I liked him going into the combine, but I had very similar grades between him, Tedero McMillan, the receiver from Arizona, and Luther Burden, the receiver from Missouri. And my biggest question mark with Golden is, does he have premier long speed? And he had the fastest 40 time, one of the fastest 40 times among the receivers at the combine. He ran a 4.29, which is blazing fast. And I felt pretty vindicated because I wasn't certain. I thought that he looked good, but I just wasn't certain because he didn't use it. I like that thought, and I know that the Bills, and it sounds like what I've been kind of learning throughout this offseason. One of the the best parts about the offseason for me when you're doing mock drafts and you're putting out projections and thoughts on teams, when you're looking at it the national perspective, fans will tell you who they want. And a lot of Bills fans have emphasized that they want defensive players, defensive linemen, cornerbacks. I think that it would absolutely behoove them to take Matthew Golden. I think that Matthew Golden would play really well off of, if he's on the board, of course, would play really well off of the strengths of Keon Coleman, who is catch point guy, super physical, great hands. Golden is a route running specialist, Z receiver who could play opposite of him on the outside. I think you would start to really round out your receiving room very effectively. And I think Golden maybe doesn't have that potential to be a 1,500-yard receiver and reach crazy heights, but I think that he could be a consistent 1,000-yard, 1,100-yard guy who's just reliable because he's got really underrated hands that could play off of attention going towards Keon Coleman.
And I know we're talking about the draft, but is that kind of indicative, or maybe the way you feel about Josh Palmer and that he's a good receiver, but maybe not really that guy they ultimately need?
Yeah, I think that Josh Palmer's fine. Like I think that he's capable. He's been very frustrating. I think that for what a lot of people thought that he could have been with the Chargers, I don't think that's a signing that you make with the belief of, okay, this solves our problem. I think that there are a lot of just general free agent moves that are just trying to have a contingency plan. There's not a lot of good receivers in this class. So if there's a chance that the Bills, wherever they're picking in the first 3 rounds, they don't feel like they're in a good spot to get a receiver, they might be reaching, or somebody that they liked is off the board. On day 3, the receiver options, they die off. It is mostly backup special team quality receivers. I think that there would be a very minimal option. So I think that Palmer as that contingency plan serves a really good purpose, but hopefully is not that final plan.
Did you have Keon Coleman last year rated as a first-round receiver?
I did. I was very high on Keon Coleman, and I know that a lot of people were griping about his 40 time, and a lot of people thought that he ran way too slow, but I never thought that was a concern. Like, I mean, the guy was a basketball player playing receiver. He was a jump ball monster. He was a guy who was always going to come down with the ball when it was thrown his way. I considered him to be worthy of going in the top 20 picks, and I was surprised that he slid as far as he did.
Obviously, people, fan bases, fans in general, just the amount of information and knowledge they can get nowadays is amazing, right? From people like you, where they can go read stuff, they can do stuff. And obviously, Keon Coleman, of course, the nouveau term we talk about receivers all the time is separation, right? And, that was his knock. We need a guy that gets separation. But I was like you, big physical wide receivers I like those kind of guys. Now, obviously, Keon didn't have the latter half of the season that we would have hoped he had. He had the injury. And then I don't think people honestly understand just kind of that rookie wall and what takes place when these guys just out of college would have been done their seasons, and now they still got 8, 9, 10 games left to play. That's hard for some of these young guys.
Yeah, the other thing, too, when we talk a lot about separation and we get super focused in on it, and we really dig into what it means for a prospect. Where he separated was in the air. Like, he separated jumping up and getting the ball like a power forward would, just trying to come down with a rebound. That was why I wasn't worried. I don't think that Keon Coleman would have deserved to have been good enough to be a top 10 pick. I think that probably would have been a little bit too bullish, but he did some really brilliant things that a lot of other guys on tape just didn't do. And it wouldn't surprise me if in the future, with how good this receiver class was overall, that if he doesn't end up being one of the best receivers from that draft class.
As we talk about the draft, we talk about the Buffalo Bills. Joe Deleone joins us from the Believe Network. You can catch him on a couple of different shows, the Rufino and Joe show, and also on AtoZ Sports Film. Really, really great content. They break it down thoroughly. You get all the information you need. And, I was looking at some stuff, and one of the players that has been mocked to the Bills more than any other player right now in college football has been Derek Harmon, the defensive lineman from Oregon. Let's kind of dig into the defensive tackles, maybe how you see Derek Harmon, because he is a name that's been talked about, maybe Kenneth Grant from Michigan and some others that you see maybe falling down to 30, or maybe one of those targets where they can get some extra picks and move to the second day and get one of these guys early at the defensive tackle spot.
I had a feeling you were going to bring up Derek Harmon. As soon as you started saying that, I was like, this is totally going to be Derek Harmon. Yeah, he's a common name that I think a lot of Bills fans, they always love to ask about, like, oh, do you think Derek Harmon's going to be there? Derek Harmon's draft stock is really crazy to me. Not like in the sense that it's unexpected or unwarranted, but you see a lot of different projections. Like, he's either a top 15 pick or he is a top 40 pick. I think that he could go anywhere in that range, which is so crazy and also can't be said for a lot of prospects. What makes him good? He's tall, he's long, he's got light feet for a defensive tackle of his size. And I think where he brings a lot of value, when we talk about defensive tackles, certain body types, certain skill sets are specific to certain roles. I think that Harmon is one of those guys that can play in a 3-4. He could play in a 4-3. He could play as a 3-4 defensive end. I think that he's got the mass and the ability to anchor against the run. He could even play nose. He kind of reminds me of Keanu Benton, who came out a couple of years ago from Wisconsin and has been on the Pittsburgh Steelers, who a lot of people thought that he was more of a 3 tech, and he ends up playing nose in that 3-4 front. So there's that multiplicity that you can use him and deploy him. I think it'd be a really good pick because you've already got Ed Oliver, who's the quicker footed guy. You get this big, massive body in Derek Harmon, who has a little bit of pass rush upside. That I think would be a really nice pairing. I'm a huge. Oh, go ahead. What are you saying?
No, you're fine. Go ahead.
I was going to say I'm a big fan of Kenneth Grant, though. I love Kenneth Grant. I don't know if he's going to be on the board that late. He is freakishly athletic for how big he is at 340 pounds. He reminds me a lot of Dexter Lawrence, and I think that he could have some possible unexpected pass rush production, just like Dexter Lawrence has had this far into his career.
Going back to Derek Harmon, does it concern you that, even like Kenneth Grant has some question marks as far as consistency and putting it on film every game, every play? Harmon had one really good year. His other couple of years weren't necessarily great, but when you look at that, how do you see it? Do you see it as a guy that was young and is ramping up to his potential? Or does that throw a question mark at you that maybe his production wasn't where it needed to be throughout his college career?
No, I'm not necessarily worried. And I think that what really helps his case is that he was at Michigan State previously, so he didn't have as many opportunities to very inconsistent teams that he was playing for. And he gets thrown into the mix for this Oregon team that has a lot more talent. Mateo Uiagalelei and Jordan Birch on the outside were really dominant pass rushers. It freed him up a lot to get one-on-one situations. And he also was clogging a ton of lanes in the run game. So I think it has a lot more to do with that ramp up that you mentioned, and also just the gradual growth and him being in a better situation with a better coaching staff.
We talked about Harmon. We talked about Grant. You don't think Grant will be there at 30. Harmon possibly. Don't know where he might go. Maybe give us another inside guy that might be there at 30, and maybe a couple names that we could look for in day 2 that would be really, really good picks for the Bills to try to solidify the middle of that defensive front, because I've said it for a long time. You went up the middle, and while Ed Oliver and they've got some active guys, not really any prototypical run stopper type dudes that you need, especially when you play the 4-2-5 and so much pressure is put upon your front four.
Yeah, there's a lot of really good options of guys that are going to be really good run defenders in this class. And I think that the first on that list that could be selected at 30, and I'd be very happy with the pick, or could still be available for the Bills' next selection in the second round, Tyleik Williams from Ohio State. He has been a player that I've been on for a couple of years now. He is very, very powerful. very underrated flexibility for an interior defensive lineman. He is the prototype that you look for a guy that generates 10 plus tackles for loss and just eats up a ton of space because he is immovable at the line of scrimmage. I'm also a really big fan of Darius Alexander, who comes from Toledo. Really good athlete. He had a pick 6 against Pitt in their bowl game, which was hilarious to watch. I posted it on my Twitter. If anyone wants to just go see that, type in Darius Alexander on my Twitter. It's in the clips that I put together for him. And he had an awesome Senior Bowl performance where he was unblockable as a pass rusher. He's got great length. Reminds me a lot of Chris Jones, who came out not that long ago, where he was a day 2 pick. No one really knew what he was going to be. And then he turned into this insane presence for the Chiefs. Other names that aren't as big: Alfred Collins from Texas, great run defender, not a lot of pass rush upside. Tremark Turner's a little bit more on the lighter side. He's very athletic. And then lastly, Joshua Farmer from Florida State, who is very unheralded because Florida State was awful this year. So he didn't get a lot of pub and a lot of recognition, but he's also got some nice flexibility and some nice lower body power to really hold his own against the run.
Joe, I want to follow up on those assessments. And you talked about the kid from Toledo, and it's funny, you look at Howie Roseman from the Eagles, and there seems to be this trend now. People, obviously the Eagles win the Super Bowl, playing well. People are like, how's Howie doing it? Well, now there seems to be kind of a trend towards, well, you got to draft guys from big conferences. You look at who Howie picks, their SEC guys, their Big Ten guys. Is there kind of that trend falling? Do you see that coming towards the NFL, that maybe we need to get these guys from power conferences and stay away from maybe the MACs and the 1AAs or the D2 type kids?
Well, I think now what's happening a lot more and more, though, is that a lot of these guys coming from these big programs, they're if you were graded a small team, you transferred up to that program. There's very few guys that do stick around. I've actually heard there are some scouts that will ask the question of, like, why didn't you transfer? It's 2025. You're getting offered money to move up, and you have the ability to jump to another school. Why did you stick around? The loyalty of it actually isn't as coveted as you would think. You would think that scouts would look at it, at a guy sticking around and valuing that he would stick around for a second contract if he plays well. But instead, there are question marks of that competition. I think, and also to your point, to your part of this question, though, why there would maybe be less of an attraction for MAC school guys and FCS guys, the competition that they're playing against now is worse. There is a lot less quality opponents that they're seeing. It's not like in the past where, even when I was playing, there were NFL guys splattered all over rosters that finished their careers. A lot of those guys leave after one season. So I definitely think it's a consideration. I don't think it is a red flag. I don't think it keeps teams from drafting players, but I do think it's becoming more of a consideration than it's ever been.
Right, because while you consider the 1AAs and the D2s are getting more really, really good high school talent because of the transfer portal and talent's trickling down, once they get there and they get to where the players they should be, then they leave right away. That's a great point, Joe. Yeah. And Joe Deleone joins us from the Believe Network. And I want to kind of move over into cornerbacks, because defensive interior, cornerbacks, we talked a little bit about wide receivers. I think that'll be addressed. Hey, who knows? It might be first round. It might be second. I don't know. I would actually be shocked if it was, but if that type of player is there, then you go for it. But I look at cornerbacks, and two guys to me that I really like. We talked a little bit about Will Johnson, but Jahdae Barron from Texas is a guy that I think fits incredibly well with the Bills. And the big reason why is because he's a corner that can play outside, and then he can also play that nickel corner over the slot receiver. And the onus that the Bills put upon their nickel guy on their 4-2-5, especially with Taron Johnson not getting any younger. So Jahdae Barron is a guy. And then the other guy that I really, really like is from Ole Miss, which is Trey Amos. And it's not the fact that, he's big, he has all this stuff, but he's got versatility in his coverage schemes.
Yep.
We need corners that can play zone, and we need corners that can come up and tackle in the run game. And I think he's one of those guys. Kind of your assessments on those two, and then maybe some other corners that we could see possibly at 30. And then we'll talk about maybe a couple guys that could bounce into day 2.
Yeah, those two guys. First, Barron, big fan of his. I think that his best deployment is how the Lions have used Brian Branch. Branch coming in was recognized as a really good coverage safety who's just going to thrive in that nickel role. And Barron doesn't have your requisite length that you look for in outside corners is part of his motivation. I think having a really good nickel corner is so important in the NFL today because of the success that we see with a lot of these slot guys and the deployment of best receivers in the slot. A lot of the best offensive coordinators are trying to do that to create those difficult matchups. I really think it's kind of like Devin Witherspoon too, where when he was picked out of Illinois, he has been amazing in the slot for that Seahawks defense. Physical, great tackler, is not afraid to get in an opponent's face, and then just has the really good instincts to make plays on the football in tight, traffic-filled situations. I think that would be another great pick, but he's also a name that I think has been really driving up draft boards, and I think could end up going pretty early. Amos, admittedly, I'm not like the biggest Trey Amos fan. I see the appeal because he's got really good acceleration. He's more of a zone-specific guy for me because he's got the length and that build to play and come downhill quickly. Just don't love his hips, which is fine.
Right.
I just don't tend to value guys that only play zone as high as I do as multiplicitous guys that can play different roles and different coverage schemes. But I do think that he has a ton of value as a day 2 prospect and is more likely to go on day 2 at the end of this draft.
Well, how about Maxwell Hairston from Kentucky? Also another guy that is a, and I'm looking at zone type corners, and I know that Beane and Bobby Babbage Jr., the DC, and McDermott, they will play man when they need to. Played a lot of man later in the season, but we know that when they're in their bread and butter, they're playing a high 2 shell and they're playing zone defense. Maxwell's a guy that's a zone heavy type of corner as well. How does he fit? How do you like him? And then, like I said earlier, maybe a couple guys for day 2 that the Bills could look at.
Yeah, Hairston is really fast, like really freaking fast. And he is a really interesting prospect in the reason that I think that his tape was good, but a lot of people don't know that he was dealing with a significant medical issue during the year. I forget exactly what it was. Someone had told it to me in Indianapolis that he was in the hospital for a period of time, and that was why he missed game action. So it wasn't your typical injury, and he lost a ton of weight. So there's times on film where he's getting knocked over and ran over while trying to tackle, and he looks really thin, but there's pretty good context for why that was happening. I think if there's a player who maybe doesn't go super early, goes somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd round that develops into a really good starter, it would be Hairston. And I like the point that you talked about how like he would do really well in a zone-based scheme because he flies upfield. He closes down on the ball really quickly. Whenever there's a little bit of a gap, he's got the speed to pick up and to really, really quickly make a play on the football. A guy that probably, for what we're talking about here, how the Bills are very zone-specific, probably doesn't fit as well, but I'm a very big fan of, and I think is going to go on to be a 1st-round pick or an early 2nd-round pick. Azariah Thomas from Florida State. His pro day 40 time wasn't super fast, but he's one of the best press man corners in the draft, if not the best press man corner, because he's got super great arm length. He wins so well with his upper body strength, and he's just so good at keeping dudes at bay and keeping them in front of him because his hips are so fluid. I think he could play zone. He just doesn't have that quick pickup speed that we typically talk about with zone-specific guys.
Joe, let our listeners know how they can watch your content, how they can see you. Before I ask you the last question, which will be non-Bills related, but I do want to get your opinion on this. Let our listeners know how they can check you out on online.
Yeah, you can follow me on X at Joe Deleone. Ruffino and Joe Show is where you can find me. The college football podcast that you referenced earlier, and then the AtoZ Sports Film Room channel, where we do a lot of great quick scouting reports on prospects. We're dropping our rankings, my co-host Ryan Roberts and I, very, very soon. And of course, appreciate the opportunity to shout that out. It's been great to talk ball with you.
No, hopefully we get you back on sometime, and likewise, we appreciate you spending the time. But I do got to ask you this. There's already the smoke screens are coming out, the quarterbacks in this draft. And obviously we're not picking a quarterback. If we do, it's going to be late, but we're probably not picking a quarterback even late, which is fine. We all love Josh Allen, but how do you see this quarterback deal going as far as the draft goes? Is it Cam Ward? Is it Shador? I mean, obviously there's not a lot of them, There's a couple of them that are pretty decent. How do you see the quarterback draft going in a couple of weeks?
Yeah, I think that right now it seems pretty solid that Cam Ward's the first overall pick. I think that we have reached a point where it's become just super obvious. It sounds like the Titans were not totally certain going into the combine what they were going to do. Then after they met with him, they fell in love with Cam Ward and they realized, hey, we can only pick first overall so many times. We need to take advantage of this. This could be the next Patrick Mahomes, Jordan Love type of a player who's got unreal arm strength. If we just build a supporting cast around him, we can have a great team. A lot of comparisons to Steve McNair too, which is like a perfect, revival for that type of guy to be taking things over. I think that though, when we move on, number 2 is a big wild card. And I do a recurring radio spot on 92.3 The Fan in Cleveland. And I said this on Tuesday, or on Monday rather. The Browns are the biggest domino in the entire draft because they could either take Abdul Carter, they could either create a trade-up situation for the Giants, depending on what happens, or they could take Travis Hunter, who's also on the board for them. There are so many different outcomes there. And depending on what they do is going to affect if the Giants are able to actually get a quarterback and to find some sort of direction. I do think, though, that there is no shot that Shedeur Sanders makes it past that 3rd pick. I think that yesterday, the signing of Russell Wilson was such a clear indication that the Giants are so desperate, that they are so badly in need of finding some sort of a solution that they needed to find not only a singular contingency plan with Jameis Winston, but a second contingency plan with Russell Wilson. So I don't see a likely world where Shedeur Sanders makes it past that 3 spot. I also, the last bit on this, I really don't think that there's going to be a 3rd quarterback selected. I don't think that Jackson Dart, I'm not buying into it. It kind of reminds me of when Will Levis was getting a ton of hype going to his draft class, and then lo and behold, he was a 2nd-round pick. Right. I just don't think that. I think it's all media buzz, and it's not a lot of actual team recognition for where he's going to go.
Going back to Cleveland, do you believe the rumors that came out today that the Cleveland Browns are talking with the Dallas Cowboys to trade for Dak Prescott, which would also make, do you throw that pick into the mix and now Dallas can move up to take Shedeur? Do you believe it? Do you believe what was out there?
I don't, and I went and I listened to the clip. The sourcing on the clip's a little interesting because I don't know if you look. I'm blanking on the guy. Yeah, I'm blanking on the guy's name, but he's got a little bit of an interesting past. Like he got arrested for tax fraud for not filing sports betting winnings. So I'm not saying that changes his credibility, but I think one should ask how legit it is.
Right.
I also went and read up on this as much as possible because I was like, there's no way that this is real, that it's only coming from one person. And it seems like a lot of insiders were really quick to dismiss it and say like, hey, this is not actually happening. I'm all for it though, because it would be freaking nuts. It would create so much chaos. Yeah, I'm all for chaos, but I just don't think that Jerry Jones is that crazy.
Last thing before I let you go, just kind of your gut feeling. What are the Bills going to do in the first round? I know that you talked about it on one of your shows about trading back to the second. Kind of your gut feeling on what you think Buffalo might do.
Yeah, I think that the 2 biggest things that we talked about today are going to come to fruition. Is it's either that trade back if they don't love the board, or they just go best player available, that they can take advantage of who's the best corner, who's the best defensive tackle, who's the best safety. I think that when you've got as good of a foundation as you do, you could even draft another edge rusher. You could, maybe you feel secure enough that you want to, as we talked about, draft a receiver, or maybe you want to build up the running back room. Probably not going to do that in the first round, but they have the opportunity to do whatever they want in this spot because there's a lot of good depth in the class, and they've already got some key contributors at certain important positions.
Folks, we appreciate you watching. We appreciate you listening on the podcast tomorrow. Hit the like, subscribe, review it. Tell your friends all about it. This is the Big O Show on Overreaction, Buffalo Sports Network. For Joe Deleone from the Believe Network, I am the Big O Jerry Ostroski. We'll be out here on Sunday with our Overreaction show, and then next week we'll pick back up on Tuesday with On the Beat. So, folks, as always, thanks again. Joe, any final words?
No, this was great getting to catch up, and I'm sure that we'll be talking soon before the draft.
Exactly. Much love. Go Bills.
I'm still the same damn kid from Oklahoma. Same old Shoot